down the cheap seats. Say if you can't. The traffic noise is sometimes difficult. Thrilled to welcome you to Explorers on the Nile. I'm particularly pleased because all this gave me a chance to contribute my little bit of a memorial to a very, very special man. Tonight we're remembering Professor Harry Smith. Now, unlike some of you young folk, I've known him for over 30 years. And I have to say that he's one of the most impressive men I've ever met in my life. Not flamboyant, extrovert, but you obviously detected a great mind. And of course he was a superstar in Egyptology, but he was also a true intellectual, a man who had not only curiosity about life, but he had a very human attitude to life. He had a human touch. He was a delight, and I was very pleased to have known him. And we must not forget that he also, as you all remember, had a great sense of humour, which he would need living with Sue Davies. Oh, yeah. Now, it worked out terribly well because I was able to put on a really suitable show. Harry favoured some of these artists here. Albert Goodwin was one of his favourites. It is my favourite. Albert Goodwin, let me tell you, went to Egypt first in 1876 when he was a 31-year-old. He went back in 1909. Hercules Brabazon there, so wealthy he never needed to sell a picture or work again in his life. He went in the 1840s, early 1850s. That's very close to the great David Roberts. Tyndale went later in the century and recorded important events like Deh el-Bahari and Hatshepsut's temple. And so we have those great 19th century visual artists. But we also, after about 30, 40 years clearing out a warehouse, we discovered the 1889 Nile album of these two knobby ladies who produced these delicious little watercolours, fresh as the day they were done because they've been tucked away in an album. Harry would have loved this. And this is a backdrop for a very special man. And who better to tell you a little bit more about him and contribute to the memory than Sue Davies. Sue.
So where do I start? Well, maybe at the beginning. I think anybody who knew Harry, who had the privilege of knowing Harry, would have been bowled over enough by that experience. But perhaps what even many people who knew Harry didn't realise was the background that he came from and how he came, in a way, to be the person he was. Because he certainly came from a very talented background. His mother would also have loved this show because she was an artist. She studied at the Slade. She won a prize. The picture with which she won the prize, Head of an Old Man, is still in the collections at University College. When she finished there, she was asked to go and work and collaborate with Whistler, but she was too shy. And so, being too shy to go and work with Whistler, she decided instead to get married to Harry's father. Now, Harry's father, if anybody thought that Harry was something out of the ordinary, Harry's father defies description almost. I mean, I made a few notes because I thought I would not get this all right. Sidney Smith, he was a Cambridge man as well. He went to Queen's College, Cambridge. He subsequently studied Semitic languages at Berlin. He came back, got a post at the British Museum as assistant keeper of Assyrian and Egyptian antiquities under Sir Wallace Budge. He was an FBA, a D.Lit. He went out when Gertrude Bell died, very suddenly under rather mysterious circumstances. Some people believe she committed suicide. Sidney went out as Director of Antiquities for Iraq and as Director of the Baghdad Museum. When he came back, he was appointed as Keeper of Assyrian and Egyptian antiquities. He was a founding member, I've got here, of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, the editor of its journal, and he resigned from the British Museum in 1948 to take the chair at London of Ancient Semitic Languages and Civilizations. How, if you are the son of a man like that, do you follow? Harry was not at all sure when he was a young man that he wished to do so, or even to try. And I don't think that anybody who really thinks back to their adolescence could blame him for that. He was rather uncertain of himself. These were big shoes to fill. But his father talked him into it, and thank God that he did, because what we would all have lost if he hadn't. So Harry, after being educated at Merchant Taylors, went to Cambridge, he went to Christ's, he got a scholarship to study classics, but as soon as he got there he swapped and studied instead Oriental languages, Coptic, Egyptian and Arabic. And he took to it like a duck to water, and while he was there he met one of the men who I think was one of the greatest influences of his life, and that was Stephen Glanville, who by that time was provost at King's. And he became a student of Stephen's. Stephen became a great friend and a mentor. And when Harry graduated, he eventually started to teach at Cambridge. And then a disaster happened. Harry's life was actually very sharply defined by death. Because one fine day in 1956, Stephen dropped dead on the spot of a stroke. And Harry was completely at sea, and I think didn't really know what to do. But he picked himself up, he went out to Egypt, he did some field work, he fell in love with the country. He came back, he taught for a little bit at Cambridge. There was a new professor there. He was unsettled. Part of his time in Egypt, he had been working in Nubia, and if you haven't bought his Nubian memoirs, I do advise you to do so, because when he went out to do field work in Egypt, the person who was then at London as Edwards Professor asked him if he would undertake the archaeological survey of Egyptian Nubia, which was the survey of the entire area that was to be flooded by the Aswan Dam. So he spent time doing the survey of Nubia. I'm going to forget something, that's why I've got this, my mind's going to go blank in a minute. When he came back, I'm going through this really, really fast because I want to get onto a few personal details of Harry. When he came back, Emery had been clearly so impressed with what he had achieved in Nubia that he asked him if he would move from Cambridge to London, which Harry did, and he became a reader in Egyptology at London University with special responsibility, curatorial responsibilities for the Petrie Museum. And all of the proceeds of all these books, and I'm very, very grateful to Chris for this, are going to the Friends of the Petrie Museum to help with conservation projects. So if you haven't already got a book, do think of it in terms of giving some money to the Petrie Museum for the Friends of the Petrie, of which Harry was the president for many, many decades. He only gave up quite recently. Emery retired from the chair, the Edwards chair, in 1970, and Harry took over. He became head of department and Edwards professor, and was one of a very distinguished line of Edwards professors, and we have one of his successors here tonight. Thank you, John, for coming. One of Harry's successors as Edwards professor is here with us tonight. And then, blow me, his life was defined by another death, because Emery dropped dead. in Egypt on the dig. And Emery was digging at a site which subsequently became known as the Sacred Animal Necropolis at Saqqara, where there are vast catacombs dedicated to the burial of the mother of Apis cows, and maybe you've heard of the Apis bull and the Serapeum. Well, the bull's mothers were buried. Vast catacombs dedicated to the burials of baboons, who were sacred to the god Thoth, and ibises, also sacred to Thoth, and falcons, sacred to Horus. And Emery had found about more than 6,000 objects at this site, including masses of papyri. And suddenly there he was, again, having just taken up the chair at London, left with this mountain of publication, a backlog of one of his predecessors, which he felt, being Harry, duty-bound to publish. But he wanted also, of course, to do his own thing. So he began the Temple Town Survey at Saqqara and excavated a huge enclosure there called the Anubeion, dedicated to the god Anubis, the god of mummification with the jackal head. And then he went on in the early 80s to inaugurate the survey of Memphis, which he then in 1988 handed over to Lisa Giddy and David Jeffries. And he then retired in the late 80s from head of department and from the chair, but he kept teaching, thank God he did, or I would never have met him, until 1994. And along came I, and I said, after a gin or two, I think, well, I'll help you, we'll do it together. Really, he said. I said, yeah, come on, it won't take long. The arrogance and the exuberance of relative youth. I was a mature student, but I was relatively young. And yes, I said, no problem, I enjoy a challenge, I would like to do this. And he jumped at it. And then another tragedy, his wife died, and he was left in a huge house on his own without being able to drive, because, and those of you who know Harry, or knew Harry, will probably say that it's a good job that he couldn't drive, because Harry was academically and intellectually brilliant, but practically not too hot. And he wasn't terribly well coordinated. Any DIY jobs, anything, it was, well, near death by deck chair we had on several occasions, and you can imagine it was quite amusing. And so Mike and I, we looked after the house for him 1 year when he went off to Australia on a visiting scholarship. He had the house on the market, great barn of a place, needed a lot doing to it, felt he couldn't go. And we said, just go, just go, clear your mind, we'll look after it. While he was away, we fell in love with it. He came back from Australia and we said, do you really want to move? And he said, no. And we said, well, why don't we all live here together? And that was over 30 years ago. And until last year, we did all live together remarkably happily. And I count it one of the greatest privileges of my life to have known this man, to have lived with him, to have loved him, to have been loved by him, and to have done this amazing amount of work. And it's something I am very, very proud of. And I know one should not blow one's own trumpet.
Go on.
But I really do think that what we achieved together was good. We did good work together, because it was, in a way, a marriage made in heaven as far as that went. His strengths reflected my weaknesses, and my weaknesses reflected his strengths. And yet it was not just a case of putting two strengths together and ending up with strength 1 and strength 2. I think I can honestly say and objectively say, looking at the work we did together, that the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. So I do think that we both did each other an enormous service and I can't still believe that I haven't got him. But I mean, there are so many other things, and Chris has said don't talk for more than 20 minutes, which leaves me with about 2. But I mean, Harry, with his background and his father, Harry was born into that setting. He vividly recalled as a child, he was only small, had to be because the tragedy of Lawrence took the accident, the motorcycle accident was in 1935 when Harry was only 7. But Harry vividly recalled as a small boy getting up from bed, rushing out to the landing and peering through the banister when Lawrence of Arabia came to supper. And one of his father's greatest friends was Max Mallowan. And Max Mallowan was married to Agatha Christie. Agatha dedicated one of her books to Harry. At Bertram's Hotel is dedicated to Harry. And she took him to the opening night of The Mousetrap. And she said she didn't like it. She didn't rate it. She didn't think it would run for long. So, just to tell you, can I come?
Yeah, go on.
Just to show you how humble, really, and self-deprecating is too strong a word, but very humble. Never blew his own trumpet. From the little I've told you, I think you will all have realised that Harry was an intellectual giant, and a giant in his field. He was world famous in his field. And I remember Carol and Chris brought Keith Grant, one of the gallery artists at that time, up to lunch. And I'd met Keith on several occasions, and we'd been talking Egyptology and what have you. And Keith knew us all just by our first names. He knew us as Harry and Mike and Sue. And when they got there, we were all sitting having canapes before lunch. And Keith said, now Sue, I really want to talk to you some more about this Egyptology business. And Harry said, well, Sue, why don't you show Keith the books? So I said, oh, okay, fine. Do you want to see the books, Keith? And Keith said, oh yeah, fine. So I got some of the books that we'd written off the bookshelf and said, here you are. Now, Harry was sitting here, Keith was sitting next to him. Keith looked at these books, he said, oh my God, you never told me you worked with Harry Smith. Because Keith knew quite a bit about Egyptology and was very interested in it. I said, yeah. But, you know, we were all looking at Keith rather oddly by this time. yeah, Keith. He said, oh, wow, he said, Harry Smith, I'd give anything to meet Harry Smith. And I said, well, you're sitting next to him. And I wished I'd had a camera. At that moment, the look on Keith's face was utterly priceless, as he realised that this person whom he'd just known as Harry was the person whom he, longed to meet, because he had never asked Harry specifically about it, so Harry had never said anything about it. And this was typical of the man. He never ever put himself forward. He never pushed himself. You could be standing next to him in a room and you would never really have overlooked him, because he did have quite a presence, a physical presence. He had a very upright stature. He was quite imposing physically. And he had a wonderful, in his prime, not so much in his old age, but he had a wonderful booming voice. He had a deep, and he never learned to whisper. And there is an art to whispering, and it's not the same as talking sotto voce. And quite often, living there, he would pursue an idea. He couldn't let it go. If he had an idea, it had to be dealt with. And Mike was away for quite a lot in those days, and probably a good job you were, because you'd have got woken up quite often. But you know, the number of times when a Harry whisper would come from the door of the bedroom at about 2 or 3 in the morning. "Are you asleep?" To which the answer was invariably rude. Like, "No, not anymore, I'm bloody not." "Why? I've got it, I've got it, I've got the answer." And it had to be dealt with there and then. Couldn't wait till tomorrow, couldn't wait till breakfast. On would go all the lights, down he'd go in his dressing gown and slippers, out would come all the drawings, and I would lie there thinking, it's no good. You know, I can't leave him to get on with it by himself. So life was never dull. You know, and he was just full on, really, the whole time. And I don't know. I don't know what else I can tell you, really, that you would want to know. But what I have done is that seeing these pictures, when I came up to see these pictures, and Chris asked me if I could help identify any of them, I went home and I was immediately struck by some of the passages I remembered from a wonderful book by Amelia Edwards, and it's so appropriate, I think, because it was Amelia Edwards who was one of the founding members of the Egypt Exploration Society, of which Harry was vice president, and she went on a dahabiya with a group of friends up the Nile, and she wrote this most wonderful book. Actually, I shouldn't be flogging her book, I want you all to buy mine, but if you haven't already read 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, and I just want to read you her brief description of Saqqara, which was the site where Harry and I worked. I'm not going to tell you any more about Saqqara because you can read about it in the book. The village of Bedrashane being left behind, we ride on through one long palm grove after another, passing between the huge irregular mounds of crumbled clay which mark the site of Memphis. Next, beyond these, we come out upon a high embanked road some 20 feet above the plain, which here spreads out like a wide lake and spends its last dark brown alluvial wave against the yellow rocks which define the edge of the desert. High on this barren plateau there stands a solemn company of pyramids, those of Saqqara straight before us, those of Dashur to the left, those of Abusir to the right. It might be thought that there would be some monotony in such a scene, and but little beauty. On the contrary, however, there is beauty of a most subtle and exquisite kind, transcendent beauty of colour and atmosphere and sentiment, and no monotony either in the landscape or in the forms of the pyramids. And then again, the colouring not to be matched with any pigments yet invented. The rocks like rusty gold, the paler hues of the driven sand slope, the warm maize colour of the nearer pyramids which, seen from this distance, takes a tender tint of rose like the red bloom on an apricot, the delicate tone of these objects against the sky, the infinite gradation of that sky, soft and pearly towards the horizon, blue and burning towards the zenith. The opalescent shadows, pale, blue, violet, greenish grey, that nestle in the hollows of the rock and the curves of the sand drifts. All this is beautiful in a way impossible to describe. And on that, I leave you to enjoy the painting.
Sue, Mike, Harry were a great team, and I'm going to miss my visits there. Well, there's 2 left, and I hope I get invitations. Don't remember the canapes, but I do remember an excessive amount of cheese and red wine, and I'm sorry I'm not there to directly toast Harry. And I hope you'll now give a really big applause, that was pathetic earlier, in memory of Harry. still open, the books are still unsold, and for those of you who haven't seen The Mousetrap, the butler did it. Thank you.